A lot of the papers are very much concerned with this. I do think it's not extraordinary anymore, but it should be extraordinary situation of a teacher who has been suspended by their head teacher. The head teacher has apologised after that teacher simply tried to teach a bunch of 13-year-olds in his class about Prophet Mohammed cartoons and Charlie Hebdo and the issues be related to religious freedom and religious faith and blasphemy laws and the right of freedom of speech. In trying to teach this 29-year-old teacher has now faced death threats and had to go into hiding with his partner and his children. Well, the Education Secretary Gavin Williamson last night condemned the threats and intimidation of the teacher and said it was completely unacceptable that teachers should not be able to expose pupils to challenging or controversial issues. Well, that was backed up by the Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick this morning as well. We've spoken to a lot of guests on this, and in a few moments we'll speak to the Chief Executive of the Ramadan Foundation, Mohammed Shafiq. First up though, let's talk to Dr Paul Stott. He's from the Henry Jackson Society that campaign very much against radicalisation. Dr Paul Stott, thank you so much for joining us. What do you make of these events and how both the school has handled it, those who are angered by it have handled it, and indeed the government as well?
Well, I think yesterday was a depressing day, and it was a bad day for the country in terms of social cohesion. Starting with the government, when we have a government that wants to put the Union on all our, put the flag on all our public buildings, to give interviews with the flag in the background. But yesterday we did seem to rather retreat from our own values in Batley. And the values are more important than the flag. The values of freedom of speech, the values of teaching children how to think rather than what to think, all of those things matter. And the school in particular, I think, has a duty to prepare children wider world. And when you look at the video of the headmaster at school yesterday, it was a little bit, it did rather resemble a hostage video almost.
Well, do you know what, though? Really... I wish the head teacher hadn't apologised for a teacher trying to teach pupils something that some of them might, or their parents might have been unhappy about. But I can understand why the head teacher did that, because he would be very fearful. As would I be fearful, as we've all been fearful ever since the Charlie Hebdo massacre. Certainly what we saw in October in Paris with Samuel Paty, the teacher who did exactly, as we can gather, exactly the same as this teacher, who then found himself a week later beheaded after going into hiding. I mean, we live in extraordinary times in Western liberal democracies where people being offended for some reason seems to, in some people's minds, admittedly, a small number of extremists, but too many extremists nevertheless, to justify killing people.
Well, it doesn't just go back to Charlie Hebdo, Julia. We can go back as far as the Rushdie affair in the late 1980s. What we need to be clear on, though, is that this is a liberal democracy, and in a liberal democracy, we've earned the right across centuries to be free to follow whatever religion we wish, to adhere to that religion, but also to criticise and critique its religion. We don't want to go backwards. And if you look at the protesters at the school gates yesterday, it was very noticeable in Batley how many were, for example, young men in their 20s, people who couldn't possibly have been parents of school children, who were too old to be pupils, who were just milling around there. And it does concern me that, as you say, that the school sort of rode backwards, but it's rode backwards in the face of a mob.
Well, I mean, and this is the thing, that there is a real concern that actually we do now, to all intents and purposes, have a de facto blasphemy law in this country, but only for one religion.
Well, if you look at how we've talked about religion generally in recent decades, what's tended to happen is when people of various faiths have been concerned or objected to something, they've been told to suck it up. And, for my parents' generation, Monty Python, for example, was a big thing, things like The Life of Brian or whatever. And again, it was suck it up. I don't think we can put cotton wool around Muslim children or their parents in a liberal democracy. We have to prepare those children for living in a society where they're going to be young adults, where they're going to meet people who hold a whole range of views. They're going to be working with people in a whole range of views, because the other option is separatism, that you just have a little enclave of people who we never say anything critical about because we're too scared, and we just sort of, jump back from them.
Dr Paul Stott from the Henry Jackson Society, thank you very much indeed for joining us to give that point of view. Let's talk to Mohammed Shafiq now. He's Chief Executive of the Ramadhan Foundation. Good morning to you, Mohammed.
Good morning, Julia.
Do you agree with Paul that actually, these are important issues to be discussed? It's important that teachers are free to show images that are being discussed, and we discuss the values of living in a free and liberal democracy, and sometimes that might involve some people of some faith or not being offended, and that unfortunately is a price worth paying.
Well, first of all, in terms of Paul, he's part of the Henry Jackson Society, which is a pretty right-wing think tank that makes it its mission to target Muslims and our way of life. I mean, this cartoon is offensive. Well, let me at least get a few sentences in before you interject.
The interesting thing is that Paul managed to have a conversation without actually attacking you or criticising you.
Muslims. He's calling the protesters as if it's a beheading video. I mean, how offensive is that? And the idea that Muslims are somehow wants to be forced to have separatism. I mean, just the sort of rhetoric we've heard from him is not surprising, because that's what they do. Now, let's get to the issue of the cartoon.
I'm not going to let that stand, Mohammed, because I've done a lot of interviews with a lot of different people over the years, including the Henry Jackson Society, and I know what they stand for. He wasn't making those comparisons, but he was making the point, which is a fair point for you to answer, that do we want special treatment for Muslims? Do Muslims get a special blasphemy law, as I suggested? Do we expect that Muslim children are uniquely should be separated out from other children in the classroom because they're unable to cope with discussing some of these issues or seeing these images? I would argue that that's actually rather patronising to Muslim children, isn't it?
Well, I think you can just see in the way this interview's been conducted. You allowed Dr Paul Stott to finish because apparently he's on the right. So you may have the same views as him. As soon as I come on, I get interrupted.
I'll tell you why I interrupted you, because you came on and you started insulting my previous guest. He did not insult you, and he didn't cast aspersions on you. No, because I'm talking over you. Because, Mohammed, would you like to have a conversation about the subject matter, or do you want to just sit here and slag off my previous guest because he doesn't agree with you? Would you like to argue the actual substantive points, or do you want to just slag someone else off?
Julie, do you want to have a debate without siding with the previous guest?
I'm allowed to take. I mean, I'm completely on his side. I completely agree with him. I don't work for the BBC,
we
Mohammed.
Know your politics. We know your politics. Yes. So we know your language. We know what you do.
Yes. But I speak for freedom of speech. Yes, I do. That's what I do.
And I speak for freedom of speech, and I've got the right to say that his offensive words around Muslims acting as if it's a beheading video. Do you think that's acceptable? No, it's not. So if you would allow me to talk about the substantive issue, which you
I was hoping you would. Yes.
Well, I'm glad we got there finally, if I may.
Right, it's 9:29, so if we don't hurry up, we're going to not be able to talk about it at all.
Well, if you give me 2 seconds to at least get a word in edgeways, then we might
Mohammed,
get somewhere.
darling, this victim thing doesn't play very well. Could you answer one of the questions?
Well, at least let me try to answer the question before you interject. And, this is the approach that you adopt. And I just think it's not beneficial.
You're still going.
It's not beneficial.
Do you want to answer a question, or do you want to just criticise me and the previous guest?
Do you want to allow me to at least articulate what I want to say? Where's my freedom of speech without you interrupting me?
Go on.
Where's my freedom of speech? The cartoon itself is offensive to Muslims. And so, yes, it's absolutely proper and right for schools to teach about blasphemy, to teach about individual freedom of speech, and to have a conversation in a respectful and tolerant way. What is not acceptable is to allow caricatures of the Prophet Mohammed with a bomb in his turban to be shown in a school to Muslim pupils who will then be offended and hurt by that. And I just don't think that's the way forward. And so can I just make one final point before you interrupt me? I condemn, as I've always done, Julia, on your program, I've condemned any violence against anybody. And I'd go to that school if the COVID regulations would allow me to. And I would urge parents to remain peaceful. And anybody who's involved in threatening this teacher or this school, I condemn that without any reservation. Is that clear enough for you?
That's 100% clear, and I'm sure everyone would
Thank
welcome
you.
that, and I wouldn't have expected anything
you.
less from you. You talk
Thank you.
about how we need to be respectful and tolerant, but you say it's offensive to Muslims to see this image. Now, I understand that it is offensive for Muslims to see this image. Do you have, though, a right not to be offended if that showing the image is important for children to be able to know what they're discussing and what is or what is not reasonable in a liberal free democracy with freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom to criticise faith, because we don't have a blasphemy law in place anymore, that it'd be impossible for kids to have that conversation without actually seeing that image. And that, yes, some may be offended, but they can say, I'm offended, I don't like that image, and here's why. And then you have a debate about it, whether or not other people should be allowed to show that image. But that doesn't need to lead to teachers being suspended or apologies, or, and I wouldn't remotely consider you to be responsible for this at all, but on the sideline also facing death threats and protests outside the school. Why would that uniquely lead, for one religion but not any others, lead to that outcome?
Well, there are people in this country on this debate who want Muslims to be silenced. They somehow don't want us to practice our faith. They have an issue with our halal meat. They have an issue with the hijab or burqa, people wearing that. They have an issue the way we practice our faith and the way we interact with wider society. And then they tell us that, we don't respect freedom of speech. So, we're going to articulate why we're opposed to the depictions of the Prophet Mohammed. We're going to express our freedom of speech and do so in a public way, but in a responsible and respectful way. And I just don't think, Julia, that you can show an image that's offensive in a school or any school to pupils, particularly in this school where I understand there is 75% of the pupils are Muslim. I just don't think it happens. And can I just say,
but your point is that you're saying people are trying to silence Muslims on this. That people criticising the wearing of face veils. I don't like wanting to wear one myself, even for the proposed health reasons. So people criticising that, people criticising different aspects of say animal way animals are treated for halal meat. Those are all legitimate criticisms that people can either agree with or disagree with, and they can debate those. It doesn't. I mean, some people may be motivated by anti-Muslim feeling to make those criticisms. Other people's might not. But the point is, we have the freedom to have that conversation. And Muslims who are offended by the showing of this cartoon, whether they're parents or anybody who's just getting involved, has the right to say, I don't like this, I don't agree with this, I'm offended by this. And we have that discussion. But the point is to have that discussion in the way that we had about, say, Life of Brian and Monty Python back, decades ago, without the overriding, pervading threat that at any point this could turn to violence, and people being fearful because of that if they exercise their freedom of speech, that they will face, as happened to Samuel Paty and happened to the Charlie Hebdo magazine writers and cartoonists, they will face death. Now, of course, the vast majority of people in this country of any faith, including Muslims, would never, ever, ever agree with that or support it or do it. Of course not. But the fact that there is that threat, uniquely from one religion, that actually makes it very difficult for people to have a safe debate about this. Do you not agree?
No, I don't agree with you. And I think that the caricature of Muslims that you just set out is what happens often. As I said, every aspect
Muslims. When did I caricature Muslims?
The single religion you talked about,
which other religious group in this country would react in this way?
Well, I can certainly say to you, if you're talking about the oppression that is directed towards Muslims that we see, and violence is used, rape is used. You've got the Chinese, you've got the Indians, and the far-right Hindu mobs that lynch people in the streets. So, living under these circumstances is unacceptable. I want to concentrate on the fact that there are people who use this cartoon to caricature Muslims. The Charlie Hebdo depiction of the Prophet it's so deeply offensive.
They mocked everybody. They did 1% of their cartoons were of Muhammad. Most of them were actually of the Pope.
Yeah, and we saw what they did when they caricatured Her Majesty the Queen only a few weeks ago in an offensive way, and there was some on the right who were criticising the magazine for that. So
but criticising is fine. Criticising is freedom of speech.
It just shows you the content of this interview, Julia. You're probably interrupting me a million times, and Paul Stott didn't get interrupted a single time. And it just shows you how polarized our debate and politics is and our national life is, that we can't have a dialogue in this
having
way.
a dialogue.
Well, you're constantly interrupting me as you've done throughout this interview.
You've actually had almost 3 times as long to talk as well. I hate to tell you.
I think you've had more time to talk.
It's
than
my
I did,
show.
It's always a pleasure.
It's my show.
It's always a pleasure.
Mohammed, we'll have to leave it there because we're 6 minutes over time. I thought we were actually having a useful conversation there, but apparently not. Mohammed Shafiq, Chief Executive of the Ramadan Foundation, thank you very much indeed for joining us once again.